on a flight with Blue Sky Airlines. No one could have guessed that a seemingly ordinary passenger would be the one to save everyone. Michael Carter, a highly experienced pilot, boarded the plane with a leg injured from a past accident. Although walking was difficult, his quick reflexes and flying skills were still intact. Alongside characters like Sarah Williams, the arrogant flight attendant, and James Walker, the enthusiastic co-pilot, this flight began like any other, but would soon turn into a surprising story. When danger strikes, will Michael overcome the prejudices of those around him and prove his worth? Subscribe to the channel to not miss this inspiring tale. The airport lounge was crowded, with constant announcements blending with conversations and the sound of luggage wheels rolling across the tile floor. Michael Carter walked into the waiting area for Blue Sky Airlines with a calm demeanor, but his legs were no longer steady as before. Those around him didn't notice him, treating him like just another passenger. However, for Michael, today's flight was an important step in reclaiming his life. He was once a proud pilot, a star in the aviation industry, but a horrific accident 3 years ago had changed everything. The injury to his leg meant he could no longer control an aircraft like before, and despite trying to adapt, the difficulty in walking led to many skeptical glances from those around him. Michael didn't feel the need to explain his past to anyone. He simply wanted to move forward, no matter the challenges. The reason he was on this flight was simple: work. He had received an invitation to attend a seminar on flight safety in another city, and this was his chance to show he could still contribute to aviation, even though he was no longer an active pilot. He had always felt a special connection to the sky and flying, and though his legs weren't as nimble as before, his reflexes and experience had never left him. As he approached the check-in counter, a few curious glances were cast his way. Michael noticed the stares, but ignored them, not letting it bother him. The people around him may not know his story, but he didn't need them to. In those quiet moments, he recalled the first time he stepped into the cockpit, the feeling of controlling the plane as it soared into the sky. That was the moment he felt the true freedom. But now everything had changed. His injury had not only affected his body, but his mind as well. He had to face the harsh reality that he could no longer do what he loved. Passing through the security area, Michael's mind was still lost in thoughts about the future. People around him didn't pay much attention to him, but Michael couldn't ignore their glances, especially when he walked slowly, his legs no longer as agile. He knew misunderstandings were inevitable, but he accepted them. Life was like that. Sometimes we have to face unfairness and prejudice from those who have never fully understood our story. Once aboard the plane, Michael felt an odd sense of peace, like coming home. The smell of jet fuel, the sound of the engines, all brought back memories of the days when he flew the skies, controlling the aircraft with an unmatched passion. But this time, he was just a passenger. That feeling made him feel a bit lonely, but he knew it was the truth he had to face. This flight wasn't for anything grand. Michael simply wanted to overcome his own limitations and find a part of the person he used to be. He might no longer be a pilot, but he was still Michael Carter, a man who had overcome many challenges and now just wanted to live a peaceful life without worrying about the doubtful stares. He realized that sometimes the truth doesn't need an explanation, only perseverance and the next steps in life's journey. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Michael leaned back in his seat, eyes closed. He didn't notice the stares around him, though a few people might have been curious about his presence. Sarah Williams, the flight attendant who had just greeted him, passed by with a brief glance of disdain. Michael didn't mind. He just needed to focus on the peaceful feeling as the plane slowly rolled down the runway. This flight would be a new journey for him, even though it might involve challenges ahead. But at least he was still flying, still living, and still moving forward. The plane began moving down the runway, the engines roaring as the wings slowly lifted off the ground. Michael Carter sat still, eyes gazing out the window, feeling the gentle vibrations of the plane taking off. However, inside the cabin, the atmosphere was quite different. While Michael remained calm, the attention of the other passengers seemed inevitably drawn to him. They stared from a distance, especially the curious and scrutinizing glances from those seated nearby. Still, Michael paid no mind, focusing only on the familiar sounds of the engines, finding a sense of peace in the flight. Sarah Williams, the flight attendant, had noticed Michael's presence since he boarded the plane. She couldn't help but frown when she saw him walking with difficulty, his steps unsteady, clearly not like the usual passengers. In fact, she wasn't particularly impressed with him from the start. The way he entered the first-class cabin, his unremarkable appearance, and especially his injured leg, made her feel a sense of disdain. Sarah was used to high-end, polite, and refined first-class passengers. Michael didn't fit into any of those categories. When she approached Michael to serve drinks, her smile was forced. "Hello, sir. May I get you something to drink?" she said, but her tone couldn't hide the contempt. Michael looked at her, responding with a gentle smile, even though he recognized the unfriendliness in her manner. "Thank you, just a glass of water," he replied calmly. But Sarah didn't respond, just furrowed her brow and placed a glass of water on the table in front of him with a cold gesture, even spilling some water onto the table. She turned and walked away immediately, not even looking back at Michael. The arrogant shrug of her shoulders made Michael sigh, a familiar feeling of racial discrimination he had faced throughout his life. However, he didn't let her actions distract him. After all, this was just a regular flight, and he didn't need to care about the disrespect from a stranger. Meanwhile, the passengers around had begun to notice. A couple seated near Michael exchanged glances, but no one dared speak up. The wife looked at her husband with disapproval, then subtly shook her head. She couldn't believe that a flight attendant would treat a passenger like this, especially in first class. But silence fell over the space as everyone realized speaking up could lead to unnecessary trouble. They could only exchange looks of sympathy, but no one dared to protest. A few other passengers sitting nearby also felt uncomfortable, but like everyone else, they chose to remain silent. A middle-aged man in a suit looked down at his laptop, trying not to pay attention to what was happening. But his discontent was evident. He even turned his face away as if not wanting to get involved to avoid causing trouble with the flight attendant. A young man sitting next to him, also visibly displeased, glanced over and smirked. But he too just sighed and returned to his phone, not wanting to cause any disruption to the flight. When Sarah returned to continue serving other passengers, she didn't spare a glance at Michael. The other first-class passengers had started to notice her attitude, but still, no one spoke up. The silence covered everything, like a cocoon protecting the safety of everyone, keeping away potential troubles. Michael sensed their gazes but didn't care. He was used to this lack of respect. It had been too long since he bothered about what others thought of him. Sometimes he felt like he was part of a world that didn't belong to him, where people judged based on appearances and differences. But he had learned to stay silent and keep moving forward, because the looks and words of others couldn't change who he was. Still, one thing Michael couldn't help but notice was the change in attitude from a few other flight attendants. A young attendant named Alex had noticed what was happening. He looked at Michael with sympathy and concern. Every time he passed by Michael, he would smile and do his best to ease the discomfort. While Alex couldn't change Sarah's attitude, he understood that this was his way of helping, even if just through a small gesture. As for Michael, he focused on doing what he could, overcoming difficulties and challenges. He knew that in a society full of unfair glances, his good actions would be the strongest response. Though those around him didn't speak up, he felt their discomfort, and he also sensed the silence and unspoken empathy in their gazes. The plane began to shake violently, and the atmosphere in the economy cabin immediately turned chaotic. Panic-stricken screams echoed from all sides as passengers clung tightly to their seats, their faces filled with fear. Items in the cabin were thrown about. Several cups of water flew from passengers' hands, sliding across the floor, and the shouting grew louder. Though the flight attendants tried to stay calm and follow the captain's instructions, the situation continued to escalate. The turbulence relentlessly shook the plane, causing it to rock violently. The captain quickly broadcasted to the entire flight, "We are experiencing turbulence. Please remain calm, fasten your seatbelts, and stay seated. The crew is performing tasks to ensure your safety." However, His voice could not erase the panic that was spreading through the cabin. Sarah Williams, the flight attendant, stood firm in the aisle, trying to perform her duties. However, her frustration grew as she noticed Michael Carter's calm demeanor. She couldn't stand his composed attitude, especially since she had underestimated him from the start. Although he wasn't the pilot in this situation, Michael's confidence and tranquility made her feel overshadowed. She couldn't understand how he could remain so calm when everything around them was falling apart. Jealousy and disdain began to well up inside her. "Michael, you're not in charge of this flight," Sarah said sternly as he walked between the rows, trying to reassure passengers. She couldn't accept his interference, even though he seemed to be doing what was necessary. She couldn't tolerate the calmness he displayed, as if the situation wasn't a big deal to him. "Please sit down. Passengers need guidance from the crew, not from a regular passenger like you." Michael didn't show any frustration in response to Sarah's obstruction. He looked into her eyes, noticing her discomfort, but also realizing something important. She was panicking. He just needed a moment to center himself, but in this moment, he had to stay calm to help those around him. He understood that assistance didn't always come from someone with authority, but from someone who could remain composed in an emergency situation. "I'm just trying to help," Michael responded gently. "If you want to keep everyone calm, you should follow these instructions." He then moved towards a group of passengers, urging them to fasten their seatbelts and stay seated. Sarah stood still, her face reddening with irritation. But instead of listening, she just stood there, watching Michael with disdain. She couldn't accept that a passenger was standing up, acting as if he were in charge of the flight. But despite her attitude, Michael continued his work, moving through the rows, reassuring passengers, and requesting that they follow safety measures. Gradually, the atmosphere in the cabin improved. The shouting from the passengers subsided slightly, but some still looked around, feeling uneasy. Sarah passed through the cabin again, but this time she couldn't hide her frustration in her gaze. Rather than comforting the passengers, she quietly walked past them, saying nothing and offering no help. She couldn't bring herself to follow Michael's instructions, even though he was doing everything correctly. Michael glanced at her once more as she passed by, and although he could sense her discomfort, he didn't let it affect his work. He stood firm, adjusting his actions and doing everything he could to help the passengers. He realized that in this situation, not everyone could stay as calm as he was. Everyone had their own way of coping, and the key was not letting panic make things worse. The passengers in the cabin began to feel calmer. They saw the confidence in Michael's actions, a man they didn't even know by name, but his actions gave them comfort and a sense of protection. Sarah, although still holding her unpleasant attitude, couldn't deny that Michael was the one who had helped stabilize the atmosphere in the cabin. She glanced at him one more time, and this time, there was something unusual in her eyes. Though she didn't want to admit it, she realized that he was the only one who had been able to keep calm in this storm. Who was he, and how could he act so effectively? Sarah had over 8,000 hours of flight time, but she had never encountered a situation like this before. The turbulence continued unabated, with the plane shaking violently, each jolt feeling like a shockwave, making everything in the cabin more chaotic than ever. Panic-stricken screams echoed from all sides, and passengers gripped their seats, their faces filled with fear and anxiety. Items flew about the cabin, several cups of water spilling from passengers' hands and sliding across the floor. The shouting grew louder and more frantic. Though the flight attendants tried their best to maintain order, it was clear the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Some passengers stood up in a panic, walking down the aisles, while others kept screaming, begging for help. In the cabin, Michael Carter stood firm, his hands gripping the armrest to keep his balance. Despite the injury to his leg, making movement difficult, he couldn't stand still. Each violent shake made him feel as though the entire plane was losing control. He glanced out the window, seeing dark, swirling clouds, with strong storms still attacking the plane, twisting it in the air. He couldn't just let the situation continue without doing anything. One thought flashed through his mind. He needed to get to the cockpit to understand the situation and find a way to help. Michael quickly stood up. Despite his weakened legs, he pushed through the pain, determined not to let it stop him. He made his way toward the cockpit, where the engines roared and warning alarms blared continuously on the plane's dashboard. As he neared the cockpit door, he realized the situation was far worse than he had imagined. The cockpit door wasn't fully closed, and Michael only needed a gentle push to enter. The scene inside left him stunned. The captain, whom he didn't know by name but recognized by his uniform, lay unconscious in the pilot's seat, his head tilted back, his face pale. Blood dripped from his mouth, clearly the result of a heavy jolt when the plane shook. Beside him, co-pilot James Walker was still conscious but looked dazed, his eyes unfocused and sweat soaking his face. He was clearly struggling with the loss of control. Michael didn't waste time. He immediately approached James, undeterred by the fact that he wasn't part of the flight crew. The most important thing now was to bring the plane back under control. "James, are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice firm but filled with concern. James looked at Michael and gave a weak nod, but he didn't seem fully aware. "The captain's passed out," James said, his voice tired and strained. "The plane, it's losing altitude too fast. I can't control it alone." Michael didn't have time to think too much. He understood that the plane was in free fall. The rapid loss of altitude only made him more anxious. The instruments on the dashboard indicated that the plane wasn't just losing altitude, but was also uncontrollable at dangerous speeds. Several warnings about speed and tilt were blaring, signaling that the plane was in an extremely hazardous state. Michael took a deep breath, collected himself, and turned back to James. "We need to stabilize it immediately," Michael said. "This needs coordination. You have to help me. Don't let the plane drop any further." James, though still weak and dizzy, nodded and tried to grab the controls. Michael didn't hesitate. He immediately started adjusting the plane's emergency systems, quickly reaching for the control panels, checking the gauges, and adjusting the plane's tilt. The warnings kept blaring, and Michael faced dozens of buttons and switches he had to change quickly. The plane continued losing altitude at dangerous speeds. Michael realized that if they didn't act immediately, they wouldn't be able to survive the situation. He focused on adjusting the flight path, reducing speed, and stabilizing the wings to prevent a flip. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control, but he couldn't let that happen. James continued to follow Michael's instructions, though still exhausted. Together, despite the plane's rapid descent, they worked in unison to prevent it from dropping too quickly. Michael couldn't afford to let time slip away. He quickly returned to adjust everything necessary. "James, focus on me. We'll bring this plane back," Michael said, his voice determined. "You have to help me stabilize the wings. Don't let them tilt too much." James struggled to pull himself together, his body still feeling weak and drained. He began to control the yoke according to Michael's instructions. Bit by bit, they began to sense the change. The plane stopped losing altitude as rapidly as before, though it wasn't fully stable yet. The warnings were still going off, but at least they had regained temporary control. Michael kept monitoring each gauge, knowing that they hadn't yet passed the hardest part. He felt every change in the air and how the plane reacted to their adjustments. He couldn't stop, couldn't let up. They needed to stabilize the situation before it was too late. Though the situation was still perilous, Michael had helped regain some control in the cockpit. But he knew the emergency wasn't over. His full attention was now on adjusting the aircraft systems and preparing for the next step, an emergency landing. The indicators on the control panel stopped sounding continuous alarms, and the plane no longer lost altitude at the terrifying rate it had before. However, Michael Carter knew they were still not out of danger. He couldn't stop, couldn't relax, even though there was temporary stability. His hands gripped the switches tightly, making gentle adjustments to the controls, executing each move with the precision he had practiced for years. The turbulence continued, but he felt small changes in the plane's reactions. James Walker, the co-pilot, sat beside him, still dazed and exhausted, but couldn't help but admire Michael's composure. Although he wasn't an official pilot in this situation, Michael's confidence and ability to manage the situation were things James had never witnessed. He realized that without Michael's help, this flight could have ended much worse. James continued to focus on the controls, but most of the work was in Michael's hands, who had perfectly adjusted everything. Michael never thought of himself as the one who saved the flight. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do, doing what he felt was right. He may not have been a professional pilot anymore, but his reflexes and skills hadn't diminished. Every adjustment to the yoke, every speed change, came from instinct and experience deeply ingrained in his body. The turbulence, the violent shaking, didn't lessen his confidence. Instead, memories of past dangerous flights, challenges he had overcome, helped him stay firm and decisive. The plane continued to fly through thick, dark clouds, but at least it was no longer in free fall. However, Michael knew time was running out. He had seen the engine temperature, speed, and pressure indicators changing, showing that the situation was still extremely sensitive. There was no time to delay. He began checking the entire emergency landing system, ensuring all safety equipment was functioning correctly. He could feel the changes in the plane's parts, as if everything was slowly returning to its correct trajectory, but he couldn't overlook any signs. James, still weak, followed Michael's instructions and continued to fly the plane with him. The two worked seamlessly together, without needing many words. The synchronicity in their movements and decisions helped the plane gradually regain stability. The warnings on the control panel began to subside, leaving only a few indicators to monitor closely. Michael and James didn't stop paying attention to every change, but now they could breathe a little easier. However, one issue remained. They still needed to land, and this emergency required a perfectly accurate landing. Michael turned to look at James, his gaze firm. "We need to land now. It's stable, but not for long." James nodded, fully aware of the seriousness of the situation. They began preparing for the emergency landing, each focusing on their task, but with one goal in mind: a safe landing. Michael began adjusting the landing systems, checking the necessary indicators one last time, and started locating the nearest runway. Though it had been a long time since he'd piloted, all the movements in the cockpit felt like second nature. He could feel every movement of the plane, the changes in the air, and made tiny adjustments to keep the plane on course. A gentle press on the controls helped him maintain altitude and speed. Though there were some difficulties, the familiar feeling returned. The plane started to slow down, descending gradually, and slowly made its way toward the runway. The outside scenery became clearer, and Michael could see the runway ahead. However, the tension wasn't over. A sudden strong gust of wind blew through, causing the plane to sway, and Michael quickly adjusted to keep it steady. He couldn't afford any distractions in these final moments. He had faced dangerous situations like this before, and now, his sharp reflexes helped him overcome the challenge once more. Finally, Michael pulled back on the yoke, gradually slowing down and beginning the descent onto the runway. The remaining turbulence still challenged him, but he couldn't let that affect the landing. The plane's tires touched the ground gently, and a soft screeching sound from the tires against the tarmac filled the air. The plane had landed safely. The feeling of the plane touching the ground was indescribable. Michael felt exhausted, but also a deep sense of satisfaction. He had helped bring the flight through the storm and safely back to the ground. His composure, decisiveness, and the flying skills he had honed throughout his career had not diminished. It was these skills, though long and used, that were still as strong and clear as ever. He sighed in relief, but in his heart, he knew the job wasn't finished. There was still post-landing work to do, but at least the hardest part was over. The plane stopped on the runway, and the passengers began applauding, their claps echoing through the cabin. Michael didn't look back at them, simply quietly walking out of the cockpit, leaving the admiration of the passengers behind him. The entire flight had been saved, and that was the only success he needed. The plane continued rolling down the runway, coming to a stop after a tense landing. The engines gradually powered down, and the atmosphere in the cabin became quiet. Only the soft sighs of relief and the comforting sense of calm from the passengers remained after the moments of panic. They exchanged looks as if they had just escaped a nightmare, and a feeling of safety slowly returned. The flight had been completed, but no one could hide the lingering concern in their eyes. Some still couldn't believe they had landed safely, but no one screamed or panicked anymore. The flight attendants entered the cabin and began their duties, reassuring passengers and announcing that the doors would soon be opened. Sarah Williams stood in the aisle, her eyes still showing signs of tension. She felt an overwhelming exhaustion, but also a sense of relief. Though she hated to admit it, she knew it was Michael Carter, the man she had looked down upon, who had saved them all. Not only did he help keep the cabin calm, but he also played a crucial role in bringing the plane down safely. Sarah glanced at the other flight attendants, not saying anything, but her eyes were filled with admiration and regret. She had been wrong not to believe in his abilities from the start. In the first-class cabin, all eyes were on Michael. Some passengers looked at him with admiration, others with gratitude, but all with a sense of respect in their eyes. Though no one spoke it, Michael knew that everything he had done today had made him a hero in their eyes. As the plane came to a complete stop, applause began to echo from the back. First, a few passengers clapped, but soon the entire economy cabin joined in, applauding Michael's courageous and swift actions. The sound of applause reverberated through the cabin, not only expressing gratitude, but also a deep respect for the man who had helped them survive the nightmare. Michael looked around, and though all eyes were on him, he wasn't seeking recognition. He simply smiled lightly, nodding in acknowledgement, but saying nothing. He didn't need to say another word. His actions had spoken for themselves. He knew everything was over. The flight was safe, and he had done his job. However, there was one person in the cabin who continued to look at Michael with surprise and respect. It was an older man, dressed in an elegant suit, clearly someone of significance. He was seated in the front row, near Michael. When their eyes met, there was a clear recognition in the man's gaze, as if he knew exactly who Michael was. He didn't clap, but his eyes couldn't hide his admiration. He stood up and walked over to Michael. "You're Michael Carter, right?" the man asked, his voice deep but full of respect. Michael looked at him, his eyes brightening slightly. He wasn't surprised that the man had recognized him. In the past, he had been a well-known pilot, and perhaps this man had heard of him. He nodded gently and simply replied, "Yes, I'm Michael." The man smiled and shook Michael's hand firmly, as if to thank him and show respect. "We've heard about you for a long time," he said, "and today I witnessed something extraordinary. You didn't just save this flight, you saved all of us." Michael just smiled lightly, not saying much, but his eyes were humble. "It's unbelievable," the man continued. "You're a legend in the aviation industry. Today, you prove that your talent and courage have never faded, even after all this time. I truly respect you." Michael felt a bit surprised, but was also touched. Over the years, he had been away from flying, but the memories and skills he had accumulated had never faded. This flight, though unexpected, proved that everything he had learned and gone through wasn't just old lessons. It still lived in him, ready to be applied when needed. The man looked at Michael as if he wanted to say something more, but then he simply nodded as if he had understood everything. "We will never forget what you did today," he said before returning to his seat. Michael stood there for a moment, quiet, but in his heart, he felt a sense of peace and pride. Sarah watched from a distance, observing everything unfold. She couldn't help but feel a change within herself. Not only did she feel ashamed for doubting Michael earlier, but she also realized an important truth. Sometimes, the things we underestimate the most are the very things that save us in the most dangerous moments. Michael didn't seek accolades, but the gratitude from the passengers, and especially the respectful gaze from the older man, proved that his actions had not been in vain. In the cabin, the applause continued, and this time, Michael could feel the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't praise, but true respect. After the plane came to a complete stop and passengers began preparing to disembark, the atmosphere inside was still charged with tension, but there was also a sense of relief. The applause from Michael continued to echo through the cabin, and the flight attendants began their duties, helping passengers get ready to exit the plane. Sarah Williams stood in the corner of the cabin, her hands still gripping the broom used to sweep up luggage, but her mind was lost in heavy thoughts. What had happened during the flight not only exhausted her, but also made her feel ashamed. Sarah was an experienced flight attendant, yet she couldn't help but acknowledge that she had been too quick to judge Michael. Her initial look of disdain, her impatience and mistaken judgment of him, had now become a stain on her conscience. Though Michael had saved this flight, and everyone was grateful to him, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of guilt rising within her. She stood there, staring out the window, her eyes clouded with fatigue. She wondered to herself, had she made too many mistakes in her life? Would she ever realize that others are capable of doing extraordinary things, even when we can't see the truth? The sense of guilt grew stronger, and Sarah couldn't bear the shame inside her. Though no one had openly criticized her, she could feel the damage she had done, even when it hadn't been voiced. Michael stood nearby, chatting with several other passengers, responding to their thanks. But Sarah couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't face his gaze. She no longer had the arrogance and confidence she once carried. The shame and regret clouded everything within her. She couldn't admit her mistake to his face, and though she knew she was wrong, Sarah still couldn't confront that reality. This feeling clung to her, making every step feel heavier. As passengers began leaving the cabin, Sarah remained standing still. She didn't feel like she could continue working there, not after what she had done to a good person, someone she should have respected. A part of her wanted to apologize, but another part wanted to escape the shame. Eventually, she could bear it no longer. Sarah turned and quickly walked through the rows of seats. She didn't look back, not daring to face anyone. Though she didn't say a word, she could feel the gazes of the passengers and fellow attendants following her, and it only made her feel more isolated. She was no longer the person she had once been, a confident, strong flight attendant. She had allowed herself to be swept up in arrogance, and now she had to face the truth. She had been wrong, and she couldn't undo that immediately. As she walked through the plane's door, she didn't look back. The feeling wasn't one of freedom, but of surrender. She wanted to escape the eyes around her, not out of fear, but out of the inability to face her actions. She wanted to get outside, to leave everything behind, and not have to confront the people she had hurt. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Sarah couldn't run away from herself. She hurried toward the exit without a word of farewell. No apologies, no sympathetic glances. Sarah just wanted to leave so she didn't have to endure the shame anymore. When she stepped off the plane, no one said anything to her, but there was a quiet sense in the air. Sarah didn't feel she had the right to enjoy the joy of the flight being saved. She only felt empty, as if she had missed an important opportunity to become a better person. Meanwhile, Michael stood there, surrounded by passengers who had already disembarked, smiling lightly in gratitude for their appreciation. He didn't care whether he was honored or not. He simply did what he could, and in that moment, he knew he had done his job. But what Sarah had felt, what she had learned throughout this flight, was a lesson he hoped she would never forget. Sarah walked out of the airport, and the regret still clung to her heart. She knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions in the future. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could start over, doing better the next time. The feeling of shame wouldn't disappear right away, but at least she had realized that sometimes it is we who need to change to make things better. Sarah stood outside the airport, taking a deep breath as if trying to exhale all the tension she had been carrying. The sense of relief from escaping the gaze of others couldn't mask the shame she still felt. In her mind, the praise from Michael still echoed, the looks of respect he had received from the passengers and her colleagues surrounding him. Michael, whom she had looked down on, was now a hero in everyone's eyes. As for her, she was just an ordinary flight attendant who had failed to remain calm in a stressful situation. Her steps slowed as she stopped by the curb, watching the crowd of passengers who had completed their journey and walked through the gate. The voices, the cheerful conversations, and the joy from the safe flight still lingered in the air. A few passengers glanced back at her, but Sarah couldn't face them. She didn't want to hear the praise or see the respect in their eyes. She couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't take back her mistakes. Instead, she simply stood there, alone, feeling lost and regretful. Sarah's heart weighed heavily. Throughout the flight, She had felt uneasy about having to confront her own mistakes. Though she didn't speak it, she knew she had misjudged Michael. Her initial disdain toward him, while he had helped and saved everyone, now stood as a stain in her conscience. The mocking words and the contempt she had shown him only made her feel small and weak. But then, something within Sarah stirred. She realized that in order to grow, sometimes you have to face yourself and the truth, no matter how painful it is. She had been wrong, but that didn't have to define her. Sarah understood that if she wanted to change, she had to start with her mistakes. That was the lesson this flight had taught her, and even though it was hard, she couldn't run from it anymore. She turned back and looked at the plane she had just exited. Part of her felt grateful to Michael, not just for saving the flight, but for helping her realize the truth about herself. Sarah didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't continue living in regret forever. She needed to change, to learn to view others more fairly, not just through shallow judgments and preconceived notions. The feeling of regret wouldn't disappear immediately, but Sarah understood that she would have to face the changes in her life. She couldn't turn back time, but she could decide how to move forward. Part of her felt relief as she realized that life didn't always offer clear choices. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the toughest moments, and it is from those mistakes that we learn how to grow stronger. She walked out of the airport where the warm sunlight bathed her face. The feeling of freedom from the suffocating air inside the plane made her feel as though she were stepping into a new journey. A journey where she would have to confront herself, her mistakes, and the opportunities to make amends. Sarah's steps weren't as heavy as before. She didn't know what the future would hold, but at least she knew that the journey to find peace within herself would begin here. She wouldn't let regret control her life. The lessons she had learned today would stay with her forever, and she would never forget that sometimes we need to face ourselves in order to change. And throughout that journey, she would never forget the person who made her realize the most important lesson. Not everyone can easily be judged or assumed, because each person has their own story, and sometimes they may be the very ones we least expect. Michael Carter, the one she had misjudged, had taught her that. She didn't know where he would go from here, but she knew that life would never be the same again. As Michael was walking out of the airport, he encountered a middle-aged man, appearing to be an important figure, standing near the passenger pickup area. The man seemed to have a special interest in Michael, his eyes lighting up as he saw him. Not because of Michael's fame, but because he recognized something deeper in his actions. "You're Michael Carter, aren't you?" the man asked with a smile full of respect. Michael turned around, slightly surprised by the man's recognition, but he simply nodded. "Yes, that's right. I'm Michael," he replied with his usual humility. The middle-aged man approached, extending his hand to shake Michael's in a courteous and friendly manner. "We've heard so much about you," the man said, "and today I saw with my own eyes a pilot of great respect. That flight, I can't imagine where we would be if it weren't for you." Michael felt a bit awkward, but he also sensed the sincerity in the man's words. "I was just doing my job," Michael responded, maintaining his calm demeanor. The man looked at Michael with admiration, then continued, "What I want to say is more than just thank you. I'm a leader in the aviation industry. Today, we are beginning a campaign to retrain the entire team of pilots and flight attendants. We want to ensure that lessons about courage, confronting prejudice, and overcoming challenges will become the foundation of our work. And I believe, if you're willing, you could be the first to lead the new generations of pilots and flight attendants." Michael heard the invitation, and, although he felt honored, he also felt a bit uncomfortable. He hadn't sought fame or attention, but the idea of being given the responsibility to help others, to share lessons about perseverance, courage, and overcoming challenges, made him pause and reflect. "Thank you very much," Michael responded. "I'll think about it." As the man walked away, Michael looked around and felt a shift within himself. This flight had not only changed his career, but it also made him realize that each person's actions could profoundly affect others. He was no longer just a pilot. He had become a leader, a role model, and perhaps someone who could change an entire system. Meanwhile, Sarah, still immersed in her feelings of shame and regret, couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. She had left after the flight, but the sense of humiliation still lingered. She knew she had been wrong, but could she change? What could she learn from Michael, from his humility and the courage he had shown? The flight had ended, but the lessons it imparted remained in the hearts of everyone involved. Michael hadn't sought fame, but this flight had changed not only him, but everyone who had witnessed it. Would his actions continue to inspire others, or would it just be a fleeting moment in their lives?